Okay, so part one dealt with how separatism rises in Quebec. Part two is going to take a look at how Canada responds to this rise of separatism. We'll start with Lester Pearson. And Pearson just believed that really what Quebec needs is a feel connection to Canada. And that's what would solve this whole issue of separatism and would stop this separatist movement from growing. That's what leads to the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in 1963. One of the findings from it is that it recommended that Canada become officially bilingual. Now, this is only the recommendation and the report. It doesn't, of course, come into law until Pierre Trudeau puts it into law. But this was to try to make the people of Quebec feel like the government's actually trying to look after their needs. The other thing that would help look after their needs in terms of feeling connection to Canada is creating a new flag. So there was one of the options that they had. The new flag gained a lot of animosity from everyone else, like everyone outside of Quebec. They saw it as, here you are changing the whole flag just for the people of Quebec. And again, they start to think that the federal government was favoring Quebec. In 1965, finally, we get that flag that you see on the right there. And even Quebec, as we said, wasn't very happy with it because when they look at it, there's no connection to Quebec identity in that flag either. So this is what we were talking about before, that when Pearson creates this flag, nobody was really happy with it. But of course, over time, I think Canadians grew accustomed to it. And today, I think more people are proud of that flag than when it was just created. Then we get to Trudeau, and as I just said, that Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, Pierre Trudeau is going to try to put that into action with the Official Languages Act in 1969. What this does is it makes Canada officially bilingual. So that means all government agencies have to offer services in both French and English. And so on the right here, I've just given you an example of Environment Canada and the Wildlife Service. Anytime you see this Canadian sign and it's a part of the Canadian government, it's always going to be in French and English. You go to Revenue Canada, you go to the customs agencies, and then they're always going to be in both languages. Trudeau also tries to get more French people appointed into positions of government whenever possible, to just give the French more of a say in federal politics. The result of this is that, again, the West will start to see this as the government cares more about Quebec, not so much about the West. Everything they're doing is trying to make Quebec happy, and nothing they're doing is trying to look after what the West wants, so the prairies in BC. So then we get to the October crisis in 1970. We want to focus on how Canada again is responding to this idea of separatism. Okay, so October 1970, the FLQ, that terrorist group, kidnaps James Cross, who's a British diplomat. Okay, they're continuing their activities of terrorism here. The FLQ then goes, kind of releases a statement and has it read on TV. And their statement is called their manifesto, which outlines their demands. Their demands are, they're asking for the government to release any FLQ prisoners. And what they'll do is they'll give them back James Cross in exchange. The government, of course, is not willing to deal with terrorists and refuse to release the prisoners. So the FLQ takes it one step further, and they go kidnap another person, Pierre Laporte, on the bottom right here, who is Quebec's labor minister. Let's show you a clip of this FLQ manifesto.
Front de Libération du Québec. Manifeste.
The FLQ Manifesto. The Front de Libération du Québec is not the Messiah, nor a modern-day Robin Hood. It is a regrouping of Quebec workers who have decided to use every means at their disposal to ensure that the people of Quebec assume control of their own destiny. The Front de Libération du Québec wants complete independence for all Quebecers, united in a free society, purged forever of its clique of voracious sharks, the patronizing big bosses and their henchmen who have made Quebec their private preserve for cheap labor and unscrupulous exploitation.
Okay, so it kind of goes on, and then I'll get into the demands of the FLQ. And this is what makes the October crisis famous in history. This, or Trudeau's response to the FLQ demands, is that he's going to ask Parliament to enact the War Measures Act. And if you remember all the way back to World War I, usually Canada will use the War Measures Act during a time of war. And what this does is pretty much gives the government powers to pass laws very quickly. And what it does is it suspends all rights. So that means the government can now go and arrest anyone without any cause. And what they could do is, if they think you're part of the FLQ, they could arrest you, to pretty much try to keep Montreal safe and Quebec safe. The surprising thing with this is that this is the very first time and only time that the War Measures Act was ever used outside of a war. It was used during peacetime. Okay? It did have the support of Parliament, so it wasn't Trudeau acting on his own doing this. Parliament supports it. The Premier of Quebec supported it, and the Mayor of Montreal supported it as well. So what they will do is they're going to start to send the federal, or the army, the Canadian Army, into Montreal to kind of watch over the city while the police conduct their investigation into where are all the kidnappings. What we're going to show you here in the video clip is Trudeau being questioned by reporters about the War Measures Act. What's interesting to see here is how he responds to the reporter, and he pretty much turns things around. So the reporter is kind of negative towards his attitude about the War Measures Act, and he starts to question Trudeau about it. But you'll see Trudeau kind of turn this around. The other neat thing is it's a very impromptu interview here. Trudeau's going to get out of his car, and right away the reporters kind of get to him. So none of this has been planned or practiced, right? Not like government today, where anytime they answer questions or give a speech, it's all kind of written out and planned out. So you can take a look.
Sir, what is it with all these men with guns around here?
Haven't you noticed?
Yeah, I've noticed them. I wonder you people decided to have them.
What's your worry?
I'm not worried, but you
So
seem
if
to
you're not
be.
worried, what's your... No, you're not worried.
I'm worried about living in a town that's full of people with guns running around in it.
Are you? Have they done anything to you? Have they pushed you around or anything?
They've pushed around friends of mine,
Yeah? What were your friends doing?
trying to take pictures of them.
Aha!
Is that against the law?
No, not at all. Well, they
Doesn't it worry you, having a town that you've got to resort to this kind of thing?
No, it doesn't worry me. I think it's natural that if people are being abducted, that they be protected against such abduction. What would you do if a Quebec minister, another Quebec minister, were abducted, or a federal minister?
Well, but isn't that one of the...
Is your position that you should give in to the 7 demands of the FLQ? And
Not at all. My position's completely the opposite.
what is your position?
My position is that you don't give in to any of them.
All right. But you don't protect yourselves against the possibility of blackmail.
Well, how can you protect everybody that is going to be a possible target without a much bigger military force, without putting somebody on everybody in the country, turning it into almost a police state?
So what do you suggest? That we protect nobody?
How can you protect them all?
Well, you can't protect them all, but are you therefore arguing that you shouldn't protect any?
Well, that's right.
That's your position.
Right.
All right, so Pierre Laporte wasn't protected and he was abducted. If you had hindsight, would you not have preferred to protect him and Mr. Cross?
Well, it's second guessing is pretty easy, but you can't
well,
do
all right,
it.
but I'm asking you the first guess now.
No, because it's impossible.
Would it have been impossible to protect cabinet ministers of the provincial government or diplomats?
I would suspect so. With all the diplomats there are in this country,
Oh, we got a big army.
you're going to use it up pretty fast at this rate.
What do you mean at this rate?
What,
Wonder if
6
I
and
could- if I
7?
could interpolate something here. You
Yeah.
seem to be thinking this in your statement in the House this morning. You seem to be saying that you thought the press had been less than responsible in its coverage of the story so far. Could you elaborate on that?
Not less than responsible. I was suggesting that I should perhaps use a bit more restraint, which you're not doing now. You're going to make a big news item of this, I'm sure.
Well, with great respect,
You know,
it is a big news item.
Yeah, but the main thing that the FLQ is trying to gain from this is a hell of a lot of publicity for the movement. And
Recognition.
and I'm suggesting that the more recognition you give to them, the greater their victory is, and I'm not interested in giving them a victory. But
Would you,
well, isn't
would you
surely
agree with the proposition that perhaps it is would be wise to use less inflammatory terms than bandits when you talk of a bunch of people who have the lives of 2 men in their hands?
you don't think they're bandits?
Well, regardless of what I think, I don't think I'd be inclined to wave a red flag in their face if they held two of my friends or colleagues with guns at their heads.
Well, first of all, I didn't call them bandits. I call the people who were in jail now bandits, who had been tried before the law and condemned to a prison term. And I said that you people should stop calling them political prisoners. They're not political prisoners. They're outlaws. They're criminal prisoners. They're not political prisoners. And they're bandits. That's why they're in jail.
But with your army troops, you seem to be combating them as almost as though it is a war. And if it is a war, is anything that they say have validity?
Don't be silly. We're not combating them as a war, but we're using some of the army as peace agents in order that the police be more free to do their job as policemen and not spend their time guarding your friends against some form of kidnapping.
But you said earlier that that you protect them in this way, but you have said before that this kind of violence, what you're fighting here, the kind of violence of the FLQ, can lead to a police state.
Sure. Well, that's what you're complaining about, isn't it?
Well, yes, but surely that decision is yours, not the FLQ's.
Yeah, but I've asked you what your own logic is. It's to let them abduct anybody, not give any protection to anyone, not call off the police. So that seems to be your position.
Not call off the police. Surely the police's job is to catch people who break the law.
Yeah, but not to give protection to those citizens who might be blackmailed for one reason or another.
Which must be half the population of the country in one way or another. I explain it badly, I think, but what you're talking about, to me, is choices. Yeah. And my choice is to live in a society that is free and democratic, which means that you don't have people with guns running around in it.
All right, then.
And one of the things I have to give up for that choice is the fact that people like you may be kidnapped.
Sure.
Sir, if you had to right now...
but this isn't my choice, obviously. You know, I think it's more important to get rid of those who are committing violence against the total society and those who are trying to run the government through a parallel power by establishing their authority by kidnapping and blackmail. And I think it's our duty as a government to protect government officials and important people in our society against being used as tools in this blackmail. Now, you don't agree to this, but I'm sure that, once again, with hindsight, you would have probably found it preferable if Mr. Cross and Mr. Laporte had been protected from kidnapping, which they weren't, because the steps we're taking now weren't taken. But even with your hindsight, I don't see how you can deny that.
No, I still go back to the choice that you have to make in the kind of society that you live in.
Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Okay, and his famous words, "Just watch me." So here's Montreal at the time, and there you can see some soldiers patrolling the street corners there. You can even see them in the background as well. Here's another shot, and there's a bunch of kids taking a look at the soldier and the helicopter in the back there. So, you know, if you pictured Montreal during October 1970, it'd pretty much be locked down. But, you know, Trudeau's perspective on it is if you're not really doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about from the soldiers. The soldiers were there to try to keep the peace as the police continued their investigation to try to find the kidnapped gentleman. So how this all unfolds, Pierre Laporte was eventually found dead, strangled in a car. I'm not completely sure, but from what the caption was on this website, that the photo on the right is the car that Pierre Laporte would have been found in. It doesn't show him, so hard to confirm. But James Cross, he was found alive. They actually found the group that kidnapped him. They negotiated with the group for his return. What the kidnappers wanted was safe passage to Cuba in return for Cross. And so that deal was actually made, and they were allowed to go to Cuba. The ones who kidnapped and murdered Pierre Laporte, they were sentenced to life in prison. So what you want to think about with this October crisis is here you have separatism growing in Quebec, getting more serious with kidnappings, and did the government respond appropriately to this crisis. Now we turn to provincial politics, and we take a look at what Quebec is actually doing within Quebec. Back in 1974, you have Robert Bourassa, who's the premier of the province, and he'll create something called Bill 22, which will state that French becomes the official language in Quebec. We then get to 1976, and that's when you have René Lévesque as premier, as leader of the party Québécois. He wins on his election promise to hold a referendum about separatism, but not necessarily jump into separatism right away. In other words, his promise was that he'd ask the people of Quebec if they want separatism or not, and that's how he won. Under Lévesque, we get Bill 101. This is the Charter of the French language. So here's just a screenshot of the Charter of the French language. So it's a whole kind of set of laws that applies to Quebec. It expands on the rules around French being the official language in Quebec. So some of the things it gives, or some of the things it states, is that Quebec government employees must be able to speak French. Children had to go to French schools, and all signs in Quebec have to be French. So that's what Bill 101 kind of furthered about Bill 22. So as René Lévesque promised, 1980, Quebec is going to hold a referendum. And the vote was on the issue of a sovereignty association with Canada. So in other words, not 100% split, but they would get independence, but they'd still have a connection to Canada, and that connection would be kind of economic ties. So not totally sure what it would mean in terms of currency, but in terms of trade, there'd still be a connection with Canada. This is where we talked about Trudeau kind of persuading people in Quebec to vote against this referendum, to vote no for this referendum. He promises that if the people of Quebec vote no and stay in Canada, what he will do is to try to create a new constitution, or kind of complete our constitution with Quebec's input into that. And what he promised them too, that they never quite got, is the recognition that Quebec would be a distinct society and equal partner in confederation with the rest of Canada. So we'll see that later on when we take a look at Canada trying to change the constitution. That idea of Quebec as a distinct society will kind of come back again and again. The result, only 40% yes and 60% no to that 1980 referendum. A few things happen in the 80s and 1990 that's going to lead to another referendum in 1995. We'll talk more about that in that multiculturalism that multiculturalism lesson that will be coming up. But to make a long story short, that referendum again, that's held in 1995, ends up in a no vote. But this one was very close. This is the one that 49.4% of Quebecers voted yes to separation, and 50.6% of Quebecers voted no. So it came very close to Quebec separating here. This actually scares the federal government a bit, and so in 2000 what they do is create something called the Clarity Act. And what the Clarity Act does is it says that in order for Quebec to separate, it needs a clear majority yes for separation. And it's, here's the irony of it, it's not very clear about what clear is, or what a clear majority is. Essentially what it means is 50% plus 1 is not good enough to be a clear majority. It gives the powers to the House of Commons to determine on their own what a clear majority would be. So if they ever held a referendum again, and let's say it's 55% to 45% and it's yes for separation, they might say in the House of Commons that's not enough of a clear majority. Right? Maybe they would consider 67% a clear majority, but that's up to the House of Commons to decide. So that's what the Clarity Bill does, or the Clarity Act does. However, if the yes vote is a clear majority, then the federal government, under the Clarity Act, is obligated to negotiate the separation of Quebec. So they have to do it. Sorry. With the Clarity Act, of course, people in Quebec are not for it, because what it does is it makes separation a lot more difficult. So on the right there, Lucien Bouchard, who's going to lead Quebec during this 1995 referendum, you can kind of see here that the Clarity Bill is something that is going to become very slippery for him. In other words, it kind of ruins the whole separatist movement. All the way in 2006, to kind of solve this issue of kind of not so much separatism, but giving Quebec the recognition of a distinct society. In 2006, the House of Commons declares that Quebec is to be considered a nation within a nation. So it's not necessarily a distinct society. It's this 2006 declaration is not a law. It's just kind of policy, and almost like what they're going to keep in the back of their mind whenever they try to create further laws. Okay, so hopefully what you should be able to do is to answer this question: how well did the Canadian government handle the issue of Quebec separatism? You want to think about, or you want to understand why separatism grows in the first place. You want to take a look at Pearson's reaction to separatism, Trudeau's reaction to separatism, Bill 101, a provincial idea, but you could think of it as Canada kind of giving the provinces power to do this. The referendum, or referenda, both are apparently okay, in 1980 and 1995, and then finally the Clarity Act. Okay?